You're muted, Andrew.
Okay. So we'll start off with a land acknowledgement, and we gratefully and respectfully acknowledge that our workplaces at CSI Pacific exist on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Squamish, Lil'wat, Esquimalt and Songhees nations of the Coast Salish peoples. I'm speaking to you today from Sydney, British Columbia, which is located within the traditional territory of the Wasanich peoples. So welcome everybody to Powering Podiums. It's a partnership between CSI Pacific and VIA Sport. And our focus today is on development and retention of officials. We're going to be talking about sharing of best practices from BC coaches, get some comments and thoughts from a coaching researcher who's a leader in his field. We'll have short presentations from our presenters and we'll have a breakout room for discussions for approximately 10 minutes. We've also got an opportunity today with Kevin Bowie, who's with us from VIA Sport, and he's going to go through some Menti questions with everybody. And then we're hopefully going to be able to report back on our discussions from the breakout rooms if we have time at the end. So today's schedule, I'll do a little bit of an introduction and we'll talk about today's why are we doing this. We've got Dan Hanoomansingh from Hockey Canada, Jennifer Keith from BC Artistic Swimming, then some Menti questions, then David Hancock from Memorial University, some breakout rooms and sharing the discussions, and then closing comments and takeaways. So because we've got a big group on the line today, I'm going to ask people to make sure that they've got their line on mute, and also if you can just adjust your name there to include your name and sport, so that helps us with the attendance there. So a quicker introduction here. So Dan Hanoomansingh, we're pleased to have Dan with us today. He's with Hockey Canada, and in his role as the manager of officiating, Dan's responsible for supporting grassroots development program as well as managing the National High Performance Program. So Dan has a unique perspective. He's got one foot in grassroots and one foot in high performance. He's also a Hockey Canada Level 5 referee and spent a decade officiating with BC Hockey at the junior and collegiate levels. We're also pleased to welcome from BC, Jennifer Keith from BC Artistic Swimming. She's worked in the sports sector for 24 years across all levels. She's led several educational initiatives using sport as a platform to engage athletes and stakeholders across areas of health and social issues as concussion management, ethical sport practices, and performance enhancing drugs. And we're really pleased to welcome today on his anniversary. So thanks, David, for joining us on your anniversary, and thank you to your wife for allowing you to join us. David is a professor of human kinetics at Memorial University of Newfoundland. His main interest is in the psychology of sport officiating. So this is going to be a great opportunity for us today to hear some of the things that he's been working on. He's been working on group dynamics, decision-making, and mental health. And alongside Dan, he's also been a hockey referee for 24 years in Canada and in the United States. So we've got a great panel today, and looking forward to where we're able to take this discussion. So when we were putting this together, one of the questions that we asked ourselves is really, why should the high performance sports system care about officiating? Is this something that we should be worrying about? So that would be our question. Why should the HP sports system be concerned about development and retention of officials? Well, our assumption, and we recognize that it is an assumption, but we really stand behind it, is that improved recruitment and retention of officials and judges will provide a higher quality of competition for our athletes. So in a nutshell, we think that better officials leads to a better level of sport. Obviously, if we've got a better level and a higher quality of competition, this supports athlete development within the province of British Columbia, which is something that we really are interested in. But we know that we can't compete without officials and judges to manage the competitive arena. I'm sure you've all been involved as an athlete in competitions, mostly at grassroots, where officials don't show up and we decide to play or we decide to compete, and that's never really the same. So one of the things that we want to talk about today is, can we do a better job of integrating officials into the high performance sports system? That's really something that we're going to try to look at today. So moving ahead now, I'm going to introduce you to Dan here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, let Dan share his screen, and then we're going to hear from Dan Hanoomansingh first of all. So Dan, if you want to share your screen.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Andrew. And thanks everybody for joining us here today. So as Andrew said, my role with Hockey Canada is the manager of officiating, but I'm really fortunate in that over the last 15 years, I've had the opportunity to work at the local and the provincial level primarily as a volunteer, and now working in sport full-time. My background professionally was in teaching as well. So I taught high school for about 5 years before I moved into this role with Hockey Canada. So a lot of what I bring to this
just the camp bike one, yeah, the free one
is from that perspective. So the thing that, and as Andrew said, even if we're talking about kind of the high performance ecosystem, officiating is really fundamentally reliant on long-term development. For years, particularly in hockey, the message that we got was our registration's flat. We had 20,000 officials last year. We have 20,000 this year. But what that obviously didn't account for was that the loss of a third or fifth or 10th year official is not equivalent to replacing them with a first year official. And one of the things, based on some of the limited numbers that we do have in hockey specifically, we lose officials at a pretty alarming clip from the time that they start. And what we found, and what I found in my experience, and as I talk to people across the country, that experience is shared, is really around this second and third bullet, which is that rather than building up capacity in a local or a provincial program and trying to do more and better, the challenge for people involved in officiating is doing the same thing over and over, just trying to keep up, right? Trying to keep the lights on and the trains running, so to speak. And so when we have something like a pandemic, that obviously just takes that kind of tinderbox and ignites it. So with that in mind, when in my role with Hockey Canada, what I'm really pushing our group to do and our staff in the larger organization to focus on is really understanding what we need to do and what matters. So for example, the biggest piece that we look at is we have 1,500 roughly local hockey associations across the country. Those are our most important unit because they are the ones that bring officials into the sport for the first time. If an official has a positive or negative experience that leads them to continue or quit, the local associations where they're going to have that experience. And then the second piece is, for a long time, the messaging really was, from a Hockey Canada level, from a national level, was, well, there's only so much we can do. And we allowed that to limit what we attempted to do. So one of the things that we're looking to do now is build step by step, but with that long-term plan in mind. Obviously no different than building any other kind of sport program. And at the end of the day, coming back to our purpose. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is kind of 4 pieces that we are working on right now that we look at as feeding into that high performance outcome. And so that, as Andrew said, we're getting better, higher quality competition at an elite level because we've done the work and the necessary sort of steps at the lower levels. So the first thing that we are doing, and this is about to roll out in about 5 weeks now on August 1st, is a total rebuild of our training and education curriculum for officials, right from grassroots, never had a whistle before, all the way up to sort of our more elite levels, and really doing that rebuild based on some key educational best practices and concepts. And what drove this was that we had allowed our resources to stagnate. We'd produced something really great, and then we'd kind of let it sit on the shelf for 3 or 5 years. And as we all know, both in sport and in education, something that's 3 or 5 years old is old, right? And it begins to fall out of date. And so what that led to was our resources stagnated, and again, pushing the burden back to the local and the provincial organizations who needed to spend time developing resources and doing it kind of in their silos instead of working together. So this is an 18-month process that we've been going through. And the challenge obviously is to ensure that once we implement this, we don't go backwards, and that we continue to update. We never have to kind of do a total rebuild ever again. The second piece is around what we're calling officiating coaching. And in a hockey perspective, we used to call the people that were in charge of our officials, they were evaluators, and then they were supervisors. And we're really moving, and this is something that I'm a big believer in, is truly moving into the coaching, not only terminology, but the ethos of coaching. As we all know from our involvement in sport, the value of coaching. And at its peak pre-COVID, Hockey Canada was looking at about 33,000 officials at all levels, which is a pretty significant participant base, given that we are not even kind of the main piece of a sport. But we didn't have that coaching piece, and we didn't have a structure to support coaches. And for us in hockey, officials start as young as 11. Across the country. Some areas have different age restrictions. They want them a little bit older, but at the end of the day, officials can start as young as 11. And if you're 11 years old and you're starting something new, you need a coach, you need a mentor, you need guidance, right? No different than, we wouldn't send a child out onto the field or into the pool without some kind of coaching, some kind of supervision, and we haven't had that. So what we're bringing in here is, and if you look at this is our kind of framework, and if it looks familiar to those of us involved in sport and in coaching, it should, because we really modeled what we wanted to do on the NCCP framework, and saying, what do we have, what context do we have, what skills do we need to give our leaders in order to build our program and build our structure. And so this is something we're currently in the process of rolling out. But the idea is, not only does it hit on the grassroots level, it hits on the competitive level, because we're now training our people to give our elite officials better coaching, better development. And then obviously at the national level, when we want to look for who are our next leaders, well, now in the future, I should say, we will have a framework that feeds these people into our national program, and just absolutely no different than coaching a sport across the country. And then the last piece, and this is something a little bit outside, but one of the things that we talk about in kind of from an organizational perspective, is trying to acquire, right? How do we take stuff that's traditionally been outside of our program, and bring it in? And one of those is para hockey, and para hockey is growing like crazy in terms of accessibility across the country. And it's something that, because it used to be so niche even 10 years ago, it was a pretty niche sport compared to what it is now. Is, from an officiating perspective, we just looked at that and said, that's outside of our scope, right? We can't really, what can we do with that? It's not really part of our main mission. And so we're going to set that aside. And what it was a lost opportunity, because from talking to officials, and I've been very fortunate to officiate para hockey myself in the past, officials love working para hockey. There is something about the difference in the culture around the sport and how they feel about what they're contributing to the sport. Every official I know, whether they're grassroots or elite, whatever level of para hockey they officiate, they come out of that saying that was a phenomenal experience. And so we looked at that from my perspective now as a leader within Hockey Canada, is we need to recognize that this is an opportunity, and we can provide officials who are already part of our program, or who maybe want to come into our program specifically for para sport, is that we can provide them with something, with training, with development, and ultimately possibly with an opportunity to work at an elite level. And so that is, again, just a concept that is mostly focused on the grassroots level and on building what we can do to serve the sport of hockey. But obviously, selfishly, it benefits us on the officiating side as well. So all of that is a little bit more grassroots focused. And when we're looking at our metrics and our key performance measures for those programs, we're looking at impact at the grassroots level in 2 to 3 years. And that's what we're really going to hold ourselves accountable to. But obviously it feeds into, at some point, a high performance context. And so we at Hockey Canada have our officiating program of excellence. And part of the challenge for us has been that we kind of assumed that elite officials will just happen, right? In a country as large as ours with a participant base of 33,000, that at some point the cream would rise to the top and we as Hockey Canada could kind of skim that off the top. But what that was missing is what all officials want and need from the programs that they're involved in. And I know David's going to talk a little bit more about what that kind of what opportunities really are meaningful to those officials, but it doesn't change regardless of the level, right? The support, the challenge, the opportunity. And obviously, like we said, an official at an elite level takes years and years and years to develop. We don't want to lose them when they hit that. And so part of that for us is just having a process and making a process that's really clear to both our officials, but also our leaders, and holding ourselves accountable. And so in an organization like Hockey Canada, what we look for is the PSO identifying those officials at a certain level, right? Saying that within their program, within what's accessible in their province, these are the top up and coming officials that they want to identify to us. And then we kind of take that process over a little bit. And previously, what was missing was this piece here at the top right hand of the slide. It was missing that ongoing mentorship, and then at the bottom left, the feedback and action. So what would happen in the past was we would provide training and evaluation, and then we would select them or not. But what that led to, and I know because I went through this as an official myself, is you'd go to a training camp and you would do well or you would do not so well, whatever that looks like, and then you'd go home and the phone would either ring or it wouldn't. And if the phone rang, it's because they wanted you to go to a national championship or to be licensed for international competition. And if the phone didn't ring, you just sat there and went, I guess they didn't like me. And I will say, full disclosure, my phone didn't ring. So I was one of the ones on the other side, which maybe influences kind of how I feel about this. But what we're really looking to do here is have that ongoing mentorship, so that even though they're working in their PSO still, and that's their primary area of competition, 50 weeks out of the year, we are preparing them for those 2 weeks out of the year where we're going to call them up to the national level or not, and have that feedback and action plan. And really, for those of us that are looking at this, we're thinking this is mostly just best practice for sport, which is true. And I think part of what we've tried to do is not reinvent the wheel, but take what can be gleaned from other sporting contexts, from best practices for coaching and sport development, and say, how can we just apply this in officiating? And the challenge is always lack of person power, lack of funding relative to kind of a larger sport organization, but there are steps we can take. So with that in mind, and that's kind of what we're doing in the immediate term, is I'm always thinking about what's the next step, right? Building, as one of the core principles was, build with the end goal in mind. And so what the next step for us is, and what I really see, is effectively a gold medal profile for an official. And it's something that in most, in all the research I've done in a lot of sports, they just don't have. And I will say this is a prototype. This is something that I'm working through. I'm not recommending that people immediately start using this framework and take it as something that's been proven, but it is something we need to think about, both from a performance perspective. And if we want to get elite performance, we need to have a pretty clear idea of what that elite performance looks like, but also from the perspective of growing the program, and from an inclusion perspective, and saying, officiating, like a lot of things, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, officiating is highly subjective, right? If I'm coaching a hockey team, I can look and say this player has more goals and more assists, or they have more hits, fewer goals against, right? It's relatively easy, I should say, to produce those quote unquote objective metrics. But in officiating, we really don't have that historically. And I think there is an opportunity to introduce some of that. And so when we think about kind of, and when I push our leadership group on saying, what are we doing today? The goal in sort of 5+ years is to get to that gold medal profile, so that the program of excellence, like anybody else that's running a national team and a national sport organization, feeds through into that. And so kind of in closing, I'll just come back to kind of what we said, what I always pushed as our core principles, that are we focusing on the LSO, because the LSO is going to feed the grassroots, and without the grassroots, we have nothing. And we will stagnate, and we will shrivel, and we may disappear. So are we focused on the grassroots? Are we focusing on education, coaching, and mentorship, which is what matters most? And then as we build, are we building with that end goal in mind? Are we setting up a program that can be naturally built on top of and expanded once we have the capacity to do that? And at the end of the day, right? Our purpose is for us at Hockey Canada, our mission statement is to make hockey more and provide those positive experiences. And in our case, in my role, positive experiences through officiating, and making that a reality for the officials across the country who want to be involved in the sport. So that wraps up my piece. Thank you very much. And I'll pass it back to Andrew here to roll on.
Dan, thanks for that. I do have one question, and we probably will keep questions to the end, but just because we've got one here, it's from Stuart from BC Speed Skating. And he's wondering if you have someone in Hockey Canada dedicated to officials, or is it a shared position?
Yeah, so 100% of my job is officiating development. I don't have to do anything else in that role. And so I'm very fortunate to be able to focus on that. And I will just add, of our 13, Hockey Canada has 13 member organizations, PSOs, and of those, 6 have dedicated full-time officiating staff people, and another 3 have part-time people who split between officiating and other things. So we're continuing to grow in that front as well.
Okay, Dan, thanks for that. That was great. I'm going to hand over now to Jen, and we'll hear from Jen.
Thank you. And Dan, that was fantastic. And so much resonated with me from my hat that I used to wear in soccer, but also aligns, even though I'm a completely different sport that I'm dealing with. And so very interesting to share the stage. I will begin by acknowledging that I am joining today from New Westminster in BC, which is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish, Cootsie, Tsawwassen, Coquitlam, Tsleil-Waututh, Stolo, Kikite, and Musqueam First Nations. And I'm very, very honored and privileged to work and raise my family and play on this land. Moving into it, one of the first things that hit me as I started to contemplate this presentation and speaking to you about this today is that there's a significant difference when we talk about officiating between refereeing or being an umpire and being a judge. And in our sport, of course, we have judges. And so just wanted to set the framework with this a little bit of kind of what is that difference? And referees and umpires make sure the rules are followed. And so to what Dan was saying, there's some objectivity to it. The puck either crosses the line or it doesn't. And in our sport, there is very much a sitting in judgment and sitting and assessing an individual in what they've just done and what they've performed and their athletic ability. And so there is a difference in terms of they don't have the movement, they don't have sort of the aerobic activity that is required in some other sports as referees do, but there is this need to be able to sit and have an opinion and to sit in judgment, as it says, and to be respected in that opinion. And that's one of the biggest things that I will certainly say has come up for me in learning this artistic swimming environment, because it's not the sport that I came through the system in myself. So one of the big things that I take with that is there's an expertise, not about the sport. I mean, there's expertise required for refereeing and umpiring about the rules of the game and being able to make judgment as you go on those rules. But this is in the technical ability. So I kind of I think of, a garbage goal is still a goal. It didn't need to look pretty. But in our sport, it is judgment on the actual movements and the complex movements that are involved in that need to be done. So there's a level of expertise in the sport that is needed to be able to be a judge in the sport, like gymnastics or artistic swimming or diving. That is a little bit different because it is very specific to the sport. So within all of that, we have recognized in our strategic plan that we strive for an athlete-centered environment. But what we recognize is that environment doesn't exist without the framework around it, which includes high-level coaches, a great governance structure, parents that support the programs and support what we do. And a big piece of that are our officials. So I will say that we do have components of our strategic plan, our key performance indicators, and all of our measurements that are specific to our officials and our ability to develop and for officials to move on through the pathway. And this primarily comes from the fact that we have looked at our sport from a risk management perspective to identify where there are huge risks, where there are gaps. At the end of the day, without the judges, it's a water show. It's a performance, and that's it. So we can't do competitions without judges. And when we jump down even more to the bottom there, and we look at our ability to deliver high performance programming in our sport, we rely on our judges for that. Our judges are part of, we are hosting a high performance camp this coming weekend, and there is an entire component of the weekend where we have judges coming in to be able to assess the athletes. So again, in a different way than some other sports, we rely on those judges to be part of our high performance pathway in identifying athletes and helping us and supporting that process for us. In our sport, 99% of our officials are female. And one of the gaps that we've certainly identified is that there's a lack of male officials. Some of that is because there's the lack of sport-specific experience and expertise, that it's not traditionally a sport that males participate in, although male participation is growing. And then there's an interesting notion that has come up recently as we've been investigating and learning more about why we're retaining officials and why they're not staying, that males are feeling in the safe sport environment that they may be perceived to be in a compromised situation, or that their intent would be misaligned because we have athletes that are in various inverted positions, in small bathing suits and various things, that males are saying, I'm not comfortable sitting in judgment of those female athletes in that role. So it's an interesting kind of new conundrum when we look at recruiting and developing officials, of why we're not getting as many males participate as we have in the past. Another big distinction with our sport, which is unlike a lot, is that our judges are volunteers. And as I get into a little bit of what we expect them to do to be able to do the job, this really stands out. In most sports, judges are paid, or referees are paid to do their job, and coaches are volunteers. It is the opposite in our sport. Our coaches are paid, and our judges are a volunteer role. And so when we look at what we're expecting them to do in a volunteer capacity, and the best that we do is cover their expenses to attend a competition, we're asking a lot of them. And so looking at that a little bit, our pathway, there are a lot of levels that go into making it to be a FINA A judge, which would be your top level judge that may get selected to the Olympics. But putting that into perspective, provincially, we're responsible for the first two levels of training and development of the officials. The next two levels are at the national level with Canada Artistic Swimming. And then when you get to level 5, you can be nominated to the first level of international judging, which would be your UANA G. And that then moves you into, provided you meet all the requirements, moving into that international platform where you start to become a FINA judge. A little more perspective within that is that at these higher levels, national and up, this is the number of officials we currently have in Canada at these levels. And it does max out. So we are only allowed to have a maximum of 10 FINA A judges out of Canada at any given time. And so even if you go through the pathway, you're waiting for retirement, you're waiting for a spot to open up to be able to progress in the process, versus it being completely merit-based on an international level. That being said, we've had tremendous success in Canada, and we are leaders in our sport in terms of officials development around the world. And I'm very pleased to say that BC has been at the top of that as well. And since '84, in the last 10 Olympic Games, Canada has been selected to send a judge to every one of those games, and 3 of those judges in those 10 games are from BC, which is pretty terrific. But looking at then kind of the what it takes and what that pathway is, this level 1 on the left-hand side that we do in BC, that process in and of itself, it looks fairly small and innocent. So, 12 to 18 hours of classroom, then there's some competency and some testing that gets done. But the process to get certified for level 1, to be able to just judge at any minor level, is really almost a 6-month process to be able to do the shadow judging and all the testing that you need to do. And similarly at level 2, it's a similar process with recertifications, reexaminations, and along the way. The pathway is a lot. It is a lot, and it just continues to move up. And as I mentioned, when you get to that international level, you're actually expected, once you get to, if you're nominated and meet the requirements to be accepted at the UANA level, you're then asked to go to the FINA certification school for judges. And I will say that, again, volunteers, and it's certainly some funding would be available, maybe through your provincial and national association, to be able to attend that. But there's a need for you to be willing to make that investment in time and money to do it. So when it comes down to it, what does it take to be a judge in our sport? And of course, the artistic swimming knowledge, and I spoke to that a little bit, of that need to understand those complex movements and those needs. And so the left-hand side is really what you'll see in FINA documents, in national documents, of this is what we're looking for when it comes to judges. That artistic swimming knowledge, the experience, and which means you're making an investment in being able to be part of competitions and travel to those competitions to be able to get that experience and gain that experience. Leadership skills in the judge's room in and of itself. Stress management, the ability to make those quick decisions in that stressful environment. Interpersonal and communication skills. A big part of what our judges do is preparatory work before they even get on deck judging the athletes. So when it comes to our meets, and it's an interesting thing, of our meets feel very stop and go because there's always these gaps between the events that take place. Our judges are actually in back rooms reviewing the individual skills for each age group, for each type of event, a technical routine event versus a free routine event. The skills required are different. And judges sit between all of these events in their panel groups, discussing what they're judging and discussing the skills and individual things that they're looking for in the next event. So it's not even a, well, you know, a penalty is a penalty in some sports, and you call it, and they do their penalty and they move on. There's a whole discussion that goes into, well, this group, we're going to be looking for this, that group, we're going to be looking for these skills, and it's a whole set of them for each event. So they're spending a lot of time working together in a mentorship environment and a educational environment, even during the competitions. Also the flexibility to be able to adjust. We're moving them from one panel, you're doing execution in this moment. No, we're switching you now to being able to do artistic impression, and you're looking at different panels for different skills. So you need to be able to be flexible and adaptable to be able to adjust what you're doing, and that willingness to learn, because it's an ongoing process. That being said, what's not on the list, and that when I look at this, is that flexible schedule. Even if you get to the national or international level, our national competitions are a week long. You're taking a week off of work to be able to go attend and invest the time, money, and energy to do that. And it goes up a notch as you get to international and as you go further. So as you go along the high performance pathway, your willingness to invest time and money and be able to be flexible to be able to do that is paramount. Looking for them to be extremely active in the local artistic swimming community and the provincial artistic swimming community to be able to proceed through the process. Very strong evaluations. It's a constant evaluation process in our sport, and our judges are being judged themselves in everything that they do and compared with each other with statistical analysis at each competition and each event. And as I already mentioned, the understanding all the various complex movements, which change every 4 years, by the way. So every 4 years, there's a new quadrennial cycle with FINA, and we have new figures, new elements, new expectations for both our coaches, judges, and athletes, or for all our coach, judges, and athletes to learn. And a big piece coming into this over and over again is a lack of bias. And we've seen it at international levels. We've seen it along the way of rankings. So you'd give your scoring, you give your rankings, and have you ranked with an unbiased lens. And that continues to be a question among judging sports in general. And how do we undo those biases or create the conditions that the judging system does not allow for them? And I will share that we are currently undergoing a full rework of the judging system on an international level. And over the next 2 years, we'll have a full-scale brand new judging system that comes into place. So what do we do here in BC? Our development model, when it looks to recruitment strategies, is it's really hard to pull somebody off the sidelines to come judge our sport. You need to have an understanding of it. So we are primarily looking for people who do already have an understanding of our sport to be able to be a judge. We're looking to current and former athletes that have that understanding. We're looking at former coaches that can't maybe commit to the week-on-week involvement in the sport, but still want to be involved. One of the strategies that we've taken is to incorporate level 1 judge training in our high performance programs. So we actually set aside time in our high performance programs with our athletes for them to learn level 1 judging and what it's all about. And it's interesting, I was at a conference that we were hosting and was standing in line for coffee one morning, and a couple of athletes were behind me that were about to do this training. And one said, "I can't believe we have to do a judging course this morning. It's so silly and what a waste of our time." And the other athlete, who was actually a national team prospect at the time, turned to and said, "Are you kidding? We get to get inside the judges' brains. We're going to learn what they're looking for." And the other athlete went, "Oh my God, we'll know what they're judging. We'll know what they're looking for." And that just adds to the complexity of the sport that we're talking about here and the judging system of there is a need for everybody to understand what we're looking for. So we work very much in collaboration at all levels, coaches, judges, and athletes in our sport in a very different way than others do. And that has been really helpful to expose athletes that side of things. We are getting to a crisis situation. The pandemic, as Dan mentioned, has created almost a crisis situation for us as well. I mean, we shifted during the pandemic to asking our judges to go from sitting on a pool deck and assessing to judging on videos and a whole host of video events that we're looking for them to do online. And we lost a lot of judges in doing that. So we are now looking at clubs being required to at least send volunteers for level 1 training to be able to just round out our requirements. Shadow judging is a key part of what we do, testing out the waters before you're put into full action. And that goes along with a lot of the mentorship that Dan mentioned as well, that is very, very key to what we do. And with parents, there are some that have become tremendous officials and ended up on FINA lists. So we don't discount them, but we do help them to start out slow to understand the sport, as many don't come from a background within our sport. An interesting piece then within this is talking about how do we retain them and what do we do? And I challenge the word for retention strategies because really I look at it from a development perspective. What we need to do is develop them, give them the proper support and mentorship to develop the skills that they need and the time. Everybody's heard it that I know would be on this call would understand they're learning too. You have to let them make mistakes. You can't expect the 11-year-old to show up and referee a perfect game. I can't expect a new judge to sit on the side and see everything they're supposed to see that happens in the water. So we have to give them time and we have to give them that proper support. And so the competition shadow is a key part of what we do to be able to support new judges. They have the support of a head panel judge. So the in-competition meetings that I referenced, event preparation and being able to ask questions and talk about exactly how a leg is supposed to be up and pointed and where it's supposed to, the angles that are all supposed to be there. Those discussions get to happen in support with your head judge during. We have pre-swimmers, which is very interesting in that a pre-swimmer before an event will happen, will come on, do the skill or do the routine, and then the judges go and discuss what they just saw before they come back and judge the full competition. And that gives them the opportunity to put into practice what they just discussed in the judges' room before they go into play. And the mentorship. Our best mentors, to be quite frank, are those that train the judges initially. And they learn, they've built a relationship with them through the courses and through that process. And then they mentor them beyond the course. They help them just feel comfortable in that room. mean, walking into that judge's room where everybody has all this experience and knowledge is very, very intimidating. And so we use those leaders as mentors beyond the course, beyond the classroom. The evaluations and statistical analysis, as I mentioned, after every competition, every event, there is that statistical analysis of how well did your marks compare with other judges, and where should you have been? Were you on par? Were you way off? And that really supports judges in understanding where they need to work and understanding some of their gaps. And our judge consultation program is a new program we've done this year, where we're putting judges directly on deck with our athletes during training and being able to give direct feedback. One of the fantastic things that this program has created for us is not only the relationship with coaches and athletes to be able to support them in their development, but they're able to mentor newer judges. So a panel of judges meets with a team, meets with a club, and they're able to work together. And we mix the levels. So you can have a level 4 judge, a FINA judge for that matter, working with newer level 1 judges on deck with athletes, talking about skills and talking about how it all gets implemented, which has been fantastic. And another big key for us around all our development and the work that we're doing is around peer sharing and creating proper education platforms. So getting towards the end of what I want to share, a big other piece of this when we talk about retention and we talk about being able to keep our judges in place and to get them on that development pathway towards the high performance path is the culture that they're living in. And so what I share with you now that you see in front of you is the perception of our sport. And I'm happy to be frank about it. And we've been doing a lot of work when it comes to the culture of our sport and what it actually is and being able to shift that. But this is quite, it very negative, and it has had that perception. What we're working towards and what we've been striving towards in BC for a number of years now is shifting the culture of our sport, creating a safe, welcoming, and inclusive environment, making sure that we have appropriate and safe interpersonal relationships, making sure that progress is merit-based, that we're applying the proper long-term athlete development framework for our athletes and for our officials and our coaches, making sure that the whole athlete is being focused on, that we're really, really working on the whole athlete. It isn't just robots that we're putting in water and expecting to execute perfection, because that's been what we've been looking for in the past. Now we're very much the holistic development of the athlete, and celebrating performance and the passion that people have for our sport, and then creating new and more opportunities for them to compete, be in the water, use their skills, because realistically, we host an athlete in our sport competes 4 times a year. And not only is that hard for them to be able to be prepared to be at the next level, it's hard for judges to continue to build their skill when they're not using them on an ongoing basis. So the more opportunities we're creating, like the judge consultation program and other programs, the more opportunities we have for people to feel comfortable in what they do and then want to stay involved. And we firmly believe that if we build this positive culture, they will come and they will stay. But the reality is right now, people are leaving our sport at the officiating level in particular because of the culture. And as you go up, it continues to get more complex. So in closing, and as Dan also discussed, that gold medal profile for judges. And I share with you that this is the gold medal profile that Canada Artistic Swimming has for our athletes. And the bottom part of it looks at the technical requirements around being an artistic swimmer. And then the top half looked at more of that whole athlete perspective in terms of athlete development for our sport. And our athletes in BC are required to demonstrate ongoing progression towards this gold medal profile to be potentially named to Team Canada. And I say the same thing as Dan. This is a sample. This is a prototype. This is me then carrying this into having been asked to think about this. What is the gold medal profile for judges? And so in looking at our athlete one, my sample around judging in our sport in particular would be that those health, life skills and wellness make a central focus for any judge, but those other pieces around it in terms of understanding the technical, tactical, but also that mental performance and that judge culture and ethics are key components to us being able to do this. And this is certainly, as I prepared for this, I reached out across the country of what's the gold medal profile for judges? What's the long-term judge development for our sport? And the answer was, well, here's a whole bunch of documents, but we don't have a specific answer to you. And so this I will be bringing forward at a provincial and national level of, let's start to shape this. And my hope is with our new judging system and with looking at this from a graphic perspective, as Dan said, in 5 years' time, we'll be on the trajectory of being able to have a gold medal profile for our judges in Canada. And I'll close with that.
Thank you, Jen. Every time I speak to or hear from someone from artistic swimming, I have a whole new appreciation for your sport, and today is no different. That was great. What I was trying to say at the start, without the ref or the judge, we can't do anything. I think your comment, without the judge, it's just a water show. I think it really encapsulates kind of the feeling, the feeling that I have. So thanks for that, Jen. Again, I like that we're talking, gold medal profile, and we're using the sporting language to talk about officials, and that's great. And we want to continue that. So. Jen, if you could stop sharing, I'm going to hand over now to Kevin Bowie, a colleague of mine from Via Sport. And Kevin is going to run through the Menti process here, and we're going to make this a little bit interactive here. Okay, over to you, Kev.
Thank you, Andrew. And thanks, Jennifer and Dan. Fantastic presentation. As a head official myself, there's a lot of valuable information here to take forward into my sport, and hopefully everybody feels that way about the presentation. I've thrown the Mentimeter link in the chat, so I think everybody's pretty familiar with it by this point. But again, I'm Kevin Bowie. I'm manager of sport development here for Via Sport, and I'm coming to you from Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people's unceded territory here in Vancouver. So yeah, I see people are populating already. So we have a lot of questions here around just how you are developing within your PSO and where officiating is sort of the sticking points, the pain points, a little bit what you're doing in terms of development is what we're trying to discover here. Great to see that there's a lot of priority on officials at this point, so fantastic. All right. Give it a couple more minutes here. All right, that looks good. All right, moving on to the next slide. Does your organization have a dedicated staff position for officiating programming? I think we'd all like to have a Dan in our office.
We'll be making this information available along with the recording and PDF copies of the presentations early next week, and I'll be sending out information just to let everyone know that's available for you to take a look at.
All right, so let's see if you do have some dedicated positions. That's great. Moving on. What kind of formalized recruitment strategy or retention strategies does your organization deploy? Great. So some more focus around materials, or no formalized strategy at this point, but some real growth in some areas here. Great to see some long-term officials development programming, gold medal profiling, that kind of thing emerging. So like Andrew said, great to see those sport terminology pieces being shifted into the officials realm. And then finally, just sort of an open discussion here about some of the pain points that you're feeling around officials development. Ones that have been emerging from a V-Sport perspective at this point have been sort of these ability to host competitions, so lack of opportunity, recruitment, retention, and this can also be related to things like the aging out piece. Like as Dan said, replacing a high performance official with a new grassroots official is a big loss for an organization, similar to any HR department. Some definite themes around opportunities, support structures, some of the safe sport concerns that I think have been addressed. I know Jennifer is doing some fantastic work in safe sport, so definitely hit her up for some ideas and conversation around safe sport too. Great. All right, thanks so much. And we'll take some of this away. I know a key part of V-Sport's strategy is identifying sort of the pain points for officials and working with government and the pathways document to help scope out and understand how to tackle the problem of retaining officials and managing volunteers at this level. So really important data here. And as Andrew said, we'll share this back. So with that, Andrew, I'll pass it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Kevin, and thank you to everybody for taking part in that. So we've been going just under an hour here. So what I'm going to suggest is if we take a 4 or 5 minute bio break here, people can do what they need to do, refresh the drink, and we're going to start back at 12 o'clock. So we'll start back in 3 or 4 minutes with David. So I'll put us on mute and pause here, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, so let's move on, and it's my pleasure to introduce David Hancock from Memorial University of Newfoundland. So David, thanks for joining us today, and I'll hand over to you.
Great, and I assume you can see my screen okay there?
Yeah, everything's good.
Perfect. Okay, well, yeah, thank you all for being here. Andrew asked me to talk a little bit about some of the research that we know about, or that I've been working on, that's specific to recruiting, retaining, and developing sport officials. So I'm going to take you through a few things here. And the idea is really just to give a snippet of different sorts of research projects that might get people thinking, just because it would probably be too much to go through in 15 minutes. So I'm just going to go through a few different things, and hopefully that gives you some information to think about going forward. I think the starting point is recruitment and looking at why people join as officials. And back in 2015, I did a study with a few other people there, looking at why people joined. And specifically, we looked at some of the reasons that long-term officials had joined. So if you had been an official for 5, 7, 10 years, what were your motivations that got you into it to begin with? And it probably isn't surprising that number one reason, love of the sport. Number two was to serve the sport. Number three was for social reasons. But when we look at it, I think a lot of organizations probably recruit people, or maybe they don't even recruit at all, but they just openly recruit people. And they don't necessarily look or have a vetting process about why people might want to join, and then target those people and try and get those people to serve the sport, right? So I think that's a little bit of a gap there. And as we've been thinking about this over the past few years, we go back to the reasons that they joined. right? None of those three reasons are specific to officiating. And so it's almost like, why does someone choose for the love of the sport to serve the sport, or social reasons? Why do they choose to become an official? Because you could get the same things out of being a coach or a technical director or an educational director. And so I think something to consider for organizations is why their officials choose specifically to become officials as opposed to any other role. Again, if we know more about that information, we can start to think about how do we vet people who might have those motivations and maybe get us a stronger recruitment pool who's more likely to stay in the sport. Opposite of what Jen talked about earlier, for most sports, 85% of officials are male. And it's likely even higher in team sports. We see 90%, 95% in some sports. This is, for a lot of organizations, again, it represents a pretty untapped group of officials that they might want to try and create specific strategies for in terms of recruiting them. I've been working a little bit with a group in the United States called Officially Human, and they have a very large data set that they sent out a few years ago. And one of the questions in that data set was simply, how can we recruit more female sport officials? And we've been looking through, there's about 1,000 females that answered that particular question. So we've been looking through those 1,000 responses, and we've come up with some main recommendations, and we're hopefully going to publish this paper later this year. The biggest thing that they talked about was that female officials should be recruited through some sort of active engagement, whether that's going to female sport teams at the high school or collegiate level where they might be ending their athletic careers, whether that was using good advertising, showing sport officials in that sport succeeding. They wanted to see those things, and again, this idea of active recruiting. But another really big piece was that female sport officials who answered the survey indicated that it would be really helpful for recruiting female sport officials if they knew that female to female mentorship programs existed. And I think that makes a lot of sense. If I'm a 15-year-old female hockey player who might want to become a hockey referee, and I know that I'm going to join my local organization, and there's going to be a 25-year-old or 30-year-old female official who's been successful who will serve as a mentor, that makes it a lot easier and a lot less scary for me to join. So in particular with the sports that have an overrepresentation of male sport officials, this could be a way to perhaps bring in some more people into the organization, some more female officials into the organization, and really create a broader, more diverse base of sport. When talking with Andrew, he also asked about, talent identification. Can we identify characteristics that might be indicative of long-term officials? And quite frankly, we don't really know. We don't have research that shows people doing this and it being successful. We don't have research saying it's not either. But what I look at is a talent ID program. The goal is to narrow down possible candidates based on characteristics, and that's not an easy task. So this is where I stole from Dan his gold medal profile. If I look at this as a hockey official myself, I say, yeah, like all these things are important. Like if you want to be, whether you want to be a really good local official, provincial official, national official, you need all these things. Just you need them at different levels, depending on how high up the ranks you want to go. But if you're looking at identifying which people might have these characteristics, that's where it becomes really tricky. So in some sports, we're not going to have our football officials. They don't have to have the skating piece. So we take a few things off there. And we start to look at some of these other characteristics and think, do all these things, if we need all of these boxes checked, does it actually narrow much? Like a lot of officials who have enough speed, endurance, aerobic power, speed, strength, endurance, and agility to officiate youth levels of soccer. Right? So maybe it doesn't do much to narrow the pool. We look at things like rule knowledge. Is that they need to have a good knowledge as they come in? Do they need to have the ability to learn? And if it's the ability to learn, how do we know what their ability to learn looks like? Looking at some of these tactical things. Are these things that we could test or assess in athletes who might be aging out to know if they would make it as good sport officials? And I think a lot of those would be difficult to create tests to know that they're good at these. And we get to these very subjective measures of, oh, well, you know, he's a captain on the team, he must be able to communicate well. Well, they might be captain on the team because he's the best player, which happens a lot in youth sport, not because they communicate well. And then when we look at some of these psychological characteristics, again, my background's in sports psychology, these are absolute imperative attributes of sport officials. But can we measure them? Can we know what someone's emotional control is and what that would be like in a game or a competition? So when we look at potential talent identification, I guess the bottom line there is that it's going to be really hard to do. I think it's great to set up what characteristics would make a good official, but that's very different than saying that we can then take those and start to identify athletes who might be aging out, who might then fit that profile. It might be much more that we need to have officials in the system for a few years and see if they demonstrate these different characteristics. So it's a quick little bit on recruitment. The second step is if we want to keep our officials, what are the things we can look at? And an area that I've been exploring recently is group dynamics within officiating, because for the most part, it's not for every sport, but for the most part, they operate as groups. And we look at why people adhere to activities, and kind of the graphic I have there on the screen. One of the biggest reasons people feel motivated to do an activity is relatedness, feeling connected to something, feeling belongingness with other people. And again, when we think about it, this is officials, they operate in these groups. It might be an in-competition group, and for a lot of sports, that becomes a very transient group where you officiate with one person on one night, and then someone else another night. Maybe halfway through a season, you officiate with someone you've never officiated with before, right? We have these, but they're still groups. It could be the larger officiating organization to which you belong, or it might also be in some cases that you actually feel like you're part of your sport organization too. Regardless, we start to see that officials are part of groups. And so maybe looking at the group dynamic matters a little bit. And like I said, this is where I've spent a little bit of attention over the past few years. So this is an article from 2018 where we looked at officiating groups and ice hockey referees. And what we found is that officials were more likely to stay as officials if they felt like they were part of a group, if they had a sense of community, if there was camaraderie within the group, and if they had strong social networks within that group. And so a lot of it is just building this idea of a group. Some of the officials we talked with were Ontario Hockey League officials, and they had an identity as a team. They called themselves Team 21 because at the time there were 20 hockey teams, and they considered themselves the 21st team within that league. And so they built this identity around that. Some other officials talked about how their organizations held social events or award ceremonies to recognize their officials, but also to create a bit of a group bond amongst those officials. And then even training sessions or combines, like having moved out here to Newfoundland in the last 3 years, one of our associations here does an annual combine. And it's not that we're testing people to assign them games for the season. It's just a chance to get together and build some of that group dynamic. So these are all important things that contribute to feeling like part of a group, which we know then will likely get more officials to stay rather than leave. We can also look at group cohesion. And cohesion, I've got the definition here. Basically, it's about sticking together in pursuit of a goal, right? So while the first study kind of looked at this idea of does someone's kind of group dynamic influence their decision to stay, cohesion is more about, we looked at it to see if this would actually help performance, because we want to see our officials perform well. And so we looked at that cohesion, we had officials self-rate their performance in the groups that they'd recently performed in. And we actually had this, you can see on the date there, this paper's been accepted about, I guess that's a week or two ago. And so it'll be published here later this summer. And we found some really interesting elements within that performance cohesion connection. Basically, everything here was related. So if the group's cohesion was higher, their performance was higher. If their group's cohesion was higher, their satisfaction was higher. And if their performance was higher, their satisfaction was also higher. So all three of these were interconnected. It really tells us that the cohesion within the group matters for performance. And I think about assigning practices, right? So if I'm assigning a baseball game, do I pick my 4 best officials? Let's say it's a national championship. Do I pick my 4 best officials? Or do I pick my 4 best officials who will perform as the best team? It's really hard to know what that would be, right? It's really hard to know all your officials enough to know, oh, these people operate really well together, whereas these don't. But it does have some implications for that. Or there might be some implications for trying to have some less transient assigning. So rather than having different people always working together, maybe there's some groups that, or pods that work together a little bit more often throughout the year to build a bit of cohesion, right? So this really does matter. If we want to see groups, officiating groups perform well, we have to think about how cohesive those groups are. And then we also, like I said, the satisfaction piece, I think, is maybe something overlooked. If you have higher cohesion and that leads to more satisfaction, we'd like to think that's probably going to reduce dropout. If you're satisfied with your job, if you're feeling connected with your group, you're likely to stay. So again, trying to find ways to build cohesion are going to be important. And some of that's going to be the things I talked about on the previous slide, but they also talked a lot about what we call task cohesion, which is trying to have cohesive in-competition strategies to work better as a team. That could be having some sort of standardized communication before a competition. That could be debriefing in competitive breaks. Things like that build that task cohesion as well, which is going to help satisfaction and performance. And then we get into development. One of the biggest things about developing officials, I think, that's not the same for athletes is looking at how much they practice, right? So if you think about an elite athlete, for every 1 hour of competition, how much would they practice, right? A house league athlete, recreational athlete, maybe 1 hour. The more elite you go, it might be 5 hours, might be 10 hours, right? You think about, someone who plays football, they play 1 game a week, but they might, and that game might be 2 hours, but they might practice 15 hours during the week. So they have all this practice time to develop their skills. But officials really don't. If you think about for every 1 hour they're in that competitive environment, how much do they practice? I think you're probably measuring it more in minutes, right? So I think of my own experiences. So in this calendar year, in terms of structured practice, we have our clinic at the start of the year, which is, we'll call it 6 hours, might be less than that, okay? And we've got some quizzes that are sent out throughout the year. That's it. And then we go out and we referee anywhere between 40, 50, 60 hockey games, depending on what level you're working. So we miss these opportunities to develop practice, which means we have to look for other ways to try and improve officiating officials' ability to get practice. And this goes back to that graphic I showed earlier, that if you want people to be motivated to something, they have to feel competent at what they're doing. And practice is where you build that competence. One of the things that we've seen recently is an increase in video-based training, right? And whether you're doing artistic swimming, figure skating, curling, basketball, hockey, doesn't matter. Decision-making is probably the most important skill for your sport officials. And if we can use certain tools to improve decision-making through video-based training, we're going to see some improvements in those decision-making skills. There have been a few studies out there on decision-making using video-based training. And generally what we see is that it improves decision-making no matter what context they're looking at, no matter what sport they're looking at, it improves their decision-making. We also see that a lot of officials rate it as something enjoyable and can be done inexpensively. So for instance, we could videotape a hockey game. We could have a camera following a hockey referee, and we can share that with other hockey referees, right? We can do this. It's pretty quick and easy to do that. We do the same thing with a volleyball official. We could do the same thing with a tennis chair umpire, where we look and follow what they're doing and share that video. There's some other ways to do it. So these are three nice little toys that I've just acquired in my lab. So on the right-hand side is a 360-degree camera. And what we have is like you can put that on a head or helmet or hat, or you can put it on someone's chest, and basically it captures full video all around them. And so we could actually get referees to wear this, and we could show those videos to new referees about learning how to maintain position and distance from a play, pulling out video clips to say, is this a foul or not a foul? The other thing we can do is we can take that video from that camera and you can upload it into the middle picture, which is a set of virtual reality goggles. And you can actually have someone have that immersive experience looking around and seeing if they can make decisions in that environment. And then on the left-hand side is mobile eye tracking glasses, where we can actually put these glasses on someone and we can look at what they're seeing. And so it's really specific. If I put this on a diving judge and I had them watch a series of dives, I could see that they're looking at the toes, they're looking at the ankle, they're looking at the knee. I could differentiate every single time they look somewhere on the athlete. And so this is another really handy tool that might help us create video-based training to develop our officials. The other way we can do it is through observation. All right, so observational learning is when you watch yourself or others either live or on video to improve your performance. And in a couple different studies, we've found that officials do their rules, technique and positions, mental performance, communication, and self-presentation. And so again, this is something that we can capitalize on in terms of whether it's sharing videos or just even encouraging officials to watch others. If we can create these opportunities or make them available to officials, we're likely to see some development in their unstructured practice environments. There's a whole lot of other stuff that I could have talked about, but Andrew said 15 minutes, so I can't run through all of it here. But these are all sorts of things that I hope that are coming out of the lab in the next 12 to 18 months, that as they get shared with the world and with PSOs and with NSOs, we can start to see that there's more and more information about sport officials that will help us understand what can we do to improve sport officiating, what can we do to retain more, develop more, recruit more, how can we help them perform better, all these sorts of things. And so hopefully you'll see some of these coming out in the next little while. And with that, I think I hit my 15 minutes. So Andrew, thanks again for the invite, and thank you all for attending and listening.
Yeah, thank you, David. That was great. I really do appreciate you putting that together for us. So one of the things that we're going to do now is we're going to go into some breakout rooms. So what I've just done is I'm going to highlight the questions here. If you just give me a second around the questions that we're going to ask. So we've got three questions here that we'd like you to discuss. The impact, what impact is the current state of officiating having on your sport's ability to drive performance? Would your organization benefit from a long-term officials development pathway or GMP for officials? We talked a little bit about that previously, and one of the mentee questions there mentioned that a little bit. And then the other question here is, do you see talent transfer as a viable tool for recruiting officials? And that's maybe looking at athletes that you've got that may be transitioning out as an athlete and maybe trying to see if you could bring them into officiating. And then the second part of that one is, could the sports sector do a better job of sharing resources and officials? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to send people off into the breakout rooms, and we're going to go in here for maybe about 8 minutes maximum. Our speakers will be in the breakout rooms. So if you're in a breakout room with one of our speakers, there's an opportunity for you to get a bit more information. What I'm going to ask is that in each room we have someone come back at the end and maybe just give us a brief synopsis of what was spoken about. And what I'm going to say is, if you can't decide who that is going to be, the tiebreaker will be whoever is the first alphabetically on your first name. But we're going to ask that our speakers are not involved in reporting back. So I'm going to send you off to these rooms now. You'll be able to see those questions from the chat box. and I'll call everybody back into the rooms in 8 minutes. So the rooms are open, so you're able now to join those rooms.
Andrew, do you want me to join my room or and then hop out to others, or do you want me to stay here in the main room for now?
Yeah, maybe just stay
Okay.
in the main room. So I'm going to just pause the recording here.